the summer of 1944, as the Allied invasion of Normandy forced the German military into a multi-front collapse, a young fighter pilot named Erich Hartmann was summoned to Adolf Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters to receive the diamonds to his Knight's Cross. He was 22 years old. He had been credited with 301 aerial victories, a number that exceeded the combined totals of every American ace in the European theater. By the war's end, that number would climb to 352, a figure that remains the highest in the history of aerial warfare, and that exceeds by more than 200 the tally of his nearest rival. The ceremony was filmed for propaganda. The young pilot, nicknamed Booby the Kid, was presented as proof that German martial superiority remained intact even as the Reich contracted under the pressure of Allied armies. What the cameras did not capture, what the propaganda could not acknowledge, and what the Luftwaffe's own commanders were only beginning to understand was that Hartmann's staggering score was not evidence of German strength. It was a symptom of German weakness. A diagnostic indicator that the Luftwaffe had built a fighter force optimized for individual glory at the expense of institutional survival. Why did the Air Force that produced the highest scoring aces in history lose control of the sky? How did a system designed to cultivate excellence systematically destroy the very expertise it celebrated? To understand the pathology of the Expertin system, one must begin with the numbers that seem, on their surface, to tell a story of individual brilliance. Erich Hartmann flew 1,404 combat missions and engaged the enemy on 825 separate occasions. Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace, finished with 301 victories. Günter Rahl, the third, with 275. On the Western Front, Hans-Joachim Marseille scored 158 victories against British and American aircraft before his death in 1942. These figures dwarf the achievements of Allied pilots. Francis Gabreski, the top American ace in Europe, finished with 28. Robert S. Johnson, the second highest, with 27. The RAF's top scorer against the Luftwaffe, Johnny Johnson, ended with 38. The disparity is so extreme that it has led generations of aviation enthusiasts to conclude that German pilots were simply better, that the Luftwaffe possessed some innate tactical or genetic superiority that allowed its men to dominate the skies. This conclusion is not merely wrong, it is dangerously backwards. The German aces scored more because they were forced to fly more, because their institutional structure prevented the distribution of experience, and because the Luftwaffe measured success in a way that guaranteed its own collapse. The first and most critical distinction between the German and Allied systems was rotation. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force established policies early in the war to rotate experienced combat pilots home after a defined tour of duty. In the 8th Air Force, fighter pilots were initially rotated after 150 to 200 combat hours, later extended to roughly 50 missions or 300 hours depending on the theater and the period. Upon completion of their combat tour, these pilots were assigned to training commands where they instructed the next generation of aviators. The system was not merely a morale measure, though it served that purpose. It was a knowledge transfer mechanism. Every pilot who survived a tour carried with him the accumulated lessons of dozens of combat engagements, lessons that could not be taught in simulators or training flights, but only in the presence of someone who had survived the real thing. When Robert S. Johnson completed his tour and returned to the United States, he took with him the knowledge of how to fight the Thunderbolt against the Luftwaffe's best. When he instructed new pilots, he taught them not from manuals, but from memory. The American training pipeline, which graduated nearly 11,000 pilots in 1942 alone and almost 21,000 by 1943, was fed by this continuous return of combat veterans to the instructional base. The Luftwaffe did precisely the opposite. German fighter pilots were not rotated. They flew until they were killed, wounded, captured, or promoted to staff positions so senior that they no longer flew combat missions. Erich Hartmann flew from his first combat mission in October 1942 until the final day of the war in May 1945, a span of nearly 3 years during which he was shot down or forced to crash land 16 times and yet never sustained a serious enough injury to remove him from the front. Günter Rahl flew 621 combat missions across the Battle of France, the Battle of Britain, the Balkans, Crete, and the Eastern Front until a spinal injury finally grounded him. Heinz Beer fought in Poland, France, Britain, the Eastern Front, Malta, North Africa, Sicily, and the final defense of the Reich, scoring 220 victories before being killed in a jet fighter crash in April 1945. These men were not exceptions. They were the system. The Luftwaffe's institutional logic held that experienced pilots were too valuable to remove from combat. The result was that hard-won battle skills were constantly drained from the force as the war progressed, because when an ace died, his knowledge died with him. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm who had himself scored over 100 victories before being promoted to a command position, recognized this structural flaw and argued for a rotation system similar to the Allies. He proposed that experienced pilots be cycled home to serve as instructors, to preserve their expertise and to elevate the quality of new replacements. Hitler and Göring rejected the proposal. The propaganda value of the super aces was too great. The psychological need to present the German public with living proof of Aryan martial superiority was too pressing, and the strategic assumption that the war would be short, that there was no need to plan for a long conflict requiring continuous training, remained embedded in Luftwaffe planning until it was too late to change course. Incredibly, the Luftwaffe did not open new pilot schools until 1944. When the training program was expanded, it was done by compressing the curriculum, reducing flight hours, and pushing pilots to the front with minimal preparation. Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who survived the Pacific War, described watching teenage German pilots wreck themselves on takeoff rolls because the training pipeline had been shortened to replace unsustainable losses. By 1945, German pilots were being certified for combat with less than 4 months of training and well under 100 hours in the air. The concentration of victories among a small elite was not merely a byproduct of the no-rotation policy. It was actively encouraged. The Luftwaffe celebrated its aces with a lavishness that no other air force matched. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, awarded to only 27 men in the entire war, became the ultimate prize in a status competition that drove pilots to prioritize personal scores over unit effectiveness. When a pilot was singled out for recognition in the Armed Forces Daily Bulletin, a high and rare honor, the performance of his peers increased measurably. A study by economists from the University of Southern Denmark, the University of Zurich, and the University of Chicago found that when an ace received such recognition, the number of combat victories claimed by other aces in his squadron climbed by 2/3 to an average of 3 victories per month. The competition for kills became an institutional obsession. German pilots joked about Halsschmerzen, neck ache, the desperate desire to earn the Knight's Cross. On occasion, this obsession spilled over into fraudulent claims, as when Hans Bendert's flight made dozens of claims during a quiet period of combat. Claims that were exposed when they were witnessed shooting up sand dunes before radioing in victories. The tactical implications of this system were profound. German fighter units were organized around their aces. The best pilots received priority for fuel, for aircraft, for maintenance, and for the most favorable tactical positions in combat formations. Wingmen were expected to protect the ace and to confirm his victories, not to score their own. The result was a highly skewed distribution of kills. By one calculation, Luftwaffe aces accounted for approximately 83% of all German aerial victories. In successful American fighter groups like the 352nd or the 56th, by contrast, aces accounted for only 37% of victories. The American system distributed kills broadly across the squadron. The German system concentrated them in a handful of men. This meant that the loss of a single German ace represented a catastrophic blow to his unit's combat effectiveness, while the loss of a single American ace, however regrettable, did not cripple the squadron's capability. The contrast becomes even more stark when one examines the scoring environment. German aces on the Eastern Front, where Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Roll built their totals, faced a target-rich environment of almost incomprehensible scale. The Soviet Union produced over 36,000 Ilyushin Il-2s alone, and total Soviet aircraft production exceeded 100,000 airframes. Many of these aircraft were flown by poorly trained pilots in obsolete machines during the early years of the German invasion. Hartmann himself admitted that in the early days, Soviet fighters lacked effective gun sights, with some pilots forced to draw aiming reticles by hand on their windscreens. The opportunities for an experienced German pilot to score were virtually unlimited. Hartmann claimed 7 victories on July 7, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk. He claimed 11 on August 24, 1944, a double ace in a day achievement that brought his total to 301. These were not anomalies made possible by superhuman skill. They were the predictable result of an experienced pilot flying multiple sorties per day against an enemy that was numerically vast but qualitatively inferior. On the Western Front, where German pilots faced the RAF and the USAAF, the scoring environment was different, but the structural dynamics were the same. Hans-Joachim Marseille's 158 victories against Western opponents were achieved in North Africa, where he flew against British fighters in a theater that allowed him to operate with relative freedom. When experienced Eastern Front aces were transferred to the defense of the Reich, they found a radically different combat environment. The American P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, flown by well-trained pilots operating in mutually supporting formations, did not present the same opportunities for individual scoring that the Soviet Air Force had. Many German super aces moved to the Western Front in 1944, scored few or no victories against American and British aircraft before being killed or wounded. The tactics that had worked against isolated Soviet aircraft, the stalk and ambush approach that Hartmann had perfected, were far less effective against American fighter formations that flew in pairs and weaves, covering each other's tails and denying the German ace the isolated target he needed for his method to succeed. The American rotation system, by contrast, ensured that experience was distributed rather than concentrated. When a pilot completed his tour, he did not take his knowledge to the grave or to a prisoner of war camp. He took it to a training base in Texas or Arizona, where he taught the next class of pilots. The American fighter groups that arrived in England in 1943 and 1944 were staffed by men who had learned from veterans who had practiced against captured German aircraft and who understood the enemy's capabilities and limitations before they ever saw combat. The average American pilot entered combat with approximately 400 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. The average German replacement pilot by 1944 had less than half that total, and often lacked even basic instrument training. The American system sacrificed the possibility of individual super aces in favor of broad squadron competence. The German system sacrificed broad competence in favor of individual super aces. And when those super aces were eventually killed, as most of them were, the German system had nothing left to fall back on. The psychological and operational consequences of the Experten system extended beyond the statistics of victory distribution. German ground crews and junior pilots developed a dependency on their aces that undermined unit resilience. When Marseille was killed in a flying accident in September 1942, his unit, Jagdgeschwader 27, suffered a collapse in morale so severe that his group had to be withdrawn from the front. When Hartmann's aircraft, marked with its distinctive black tulip nose art, approached a Soviet formation, enemy pilots reportedly broke and fled, allowing the rest of his unit to engage with reduced resistance. This phenomenon, while beneficial to Hartmann's personal score, was tactically perverse. It meant that the enemy was learning to identify and avoid the ace, while the ace's own wingmen and squadron mates were denied the combat experience that would have made them independently effective. Hartmann eventually had the tulip marking removed because it was suppressing his kill rate, as Soviet pilots avoided him. But by then, the pattern was established. The German fighter force had become a host organism for a small number of predatory aces, feeding them targets and confirming their kills, while the majority of pilots remained underdeveloped and dependent. The American and British systems, by rotating pilots and distributing experience, built a force that was resilient to the loss of any individual. The death of Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace, was a tragedy but not a catastrophe. His squadron continued to fight effectively because the weave he had helped to validate was now standard doctrine, practiced by dozens of pilots who had learned it from him and from others. The death of an American ace did not destroy the unit's institutional memory, because that memory had been encoded in training programs, tactical manuals, and the habits of dozens of survivors. The death of a German ace, by contrast, was an irreplaceable loss. When Hans-Joachim Marseille died, his tactical innovations, his particular genius for deflection shooting, his intuitive understanding of combat geometry, all vanished. The Luftwaffe had no mechanism for capturing and transmitting that knowledge. It had bet everything on the man, and when the man was gone, the bet was lost. By late 1944, the consequences of this systemic failure were visible to anyone who cared to look. The Luftwaffe still possessed a handful of pilots with extraordinary skills. Hartmann was still scoring victories in the east. Baer was still fighting in the west. But the force around them had hollowed out. The average German fighter pilot facing the Allied onslaught was a teenager with minimal training, flying an aircraft he barely understood, against opponents who had been trained by combat veterans and who outnumbered him by margins that made individual skill irrelevant. The Experten who remained were no longer the cutting edge of a lethal force. They were the survivors of a collapsing system, racking up kills against increasingly desperate odds while their air force disintegrated around them. The final irony of the Experten system is that it produced the very outcome it was designed to prevent. The Luftwaffe had concentrated its best pilots in combat to prevent their skills from being wasted on training duties. The result was that their skills were wasted on attrition. Every ace who died in combat took with him the equivalent of a training squadron's worth of institutional knowledge. The Americans, by rotating their best pilots home, ensured that combat experience was multiplied across the force. A pilot who scored 28 victories in Europe, like Gabreski, might have trained 100 replacements before the war ended. Hartmann, who scored 352, trained no one. He was too valuable to remove from the front. And so his 352 victories, for all their propaganda value, contributed nothing to the survival of the force that had created him. When Hartmann met Hitler in August 1944 to receive the diamonds, he reportedly discussed at length the shortcomings of fighter pilot training. Hitler allegedly admitted that militarily the war was lost and expressed the wish that the Luftwaffe had more like him and Rudel. The wish was characteristic of the Führer's magical thinking, the belief that individual heroes could compensate for systemic failure. What the Luftwaffe needed was not more Hartmanns. It was a system that could produce competent pilots in the tens of thousands. A system that valued squadron effectiveness over individual scoring. A system that understood that in a war of industrial attrition, the distribution of competence matters more than the concentration of genius. The United States and Britain built that system. Germany did not. And so the air war was won not by the side that produced the highest scoring aces, but by the side that produced the most adequately trained pilots, the most resilient squadrons, and the most effective mechanism for transforming combat experience into institutional knowledge. The Experten system gave Germany its legends. It also gave Germany its defeat. The 352 victories of Erich Hartmann remain a remarkable individual achievement. But they are also a monument to a force that measured itself by the wrong metrics, that celebrated the wrong virtues, and that destroyed itself by refusing to let its best men come home.